Okay. Well, welcome everyone to the Wilson Science and Technology Forum. Uh, Science, engineering, and technology have an outsized impact on our culture. Yeah, especially in today's technology intense world. And many of those people who are in leadership positions in technology-based companies are engineers. And so it's interesting to ask whether including courses in ethics and perhaps even in social science into the engineering curriculum would provide a useful guide to these folks later in their careers as they make judgments on introducing technology into the marketplace. My Purdue colleague, Andrew Brightman, is here today with us. Andrew, it's good to see you. We're looking for your presentation, which has the absolutely perfect title, and that is, Can You Teach Engineers to Be Ethical? Let's find out. Andrew, the floor is yours.
I'm going to share my slide here. I hope you can see that.
Yeah,
Thank you,
perfect.
Ron. Thank you so much. And I'm really appreciative to have this opportunity to speak with this Wilson Science and Technology Forum. I've met some of the members, amazing backgrounds in technology, in political and communications. I think I'm in the right crowd, although I'm jealous that I don't get to hear all your stories. My story, and this is my story. I'm not here as an expert. Actually, I'm here as a practitioner. I've been trying to understand how and if it's possible to teach ethics to engineers for over 2 decades now. And I'm going to share with you today some of my learnings. Some of it might be really familiar. I hope it is. Some of it might be some new ideas, and I'm willing to chat about those. So feel free to ask questions as we go along. I have a lot of material to cover from 20 years, and I'll go as fast and try to cover as much as I can. So there might be some time for a discussion at the end, but I'd love a discussion along the way. I do want to say a couple things. The things I'm going to tell you are things I've gleaned along the way, but they're still my opinions. I don't claim to represent any of my colleagues or the funding agencies or Purdue University, where I am. And I also have no financial conflicts of interest to disclose at this point. So let's get to the talk here. I want to start with this slide, which highlights an article in particularly an article in the a 2017 issue of The Bridge from the NAE that was really captured. This is where I caught this title. Um, Deborah Johnson, who was then Olson Professor of Applied Ethics at University of Virginia, um, wrote the final article of this issue on engineering ethics, and her title was "Can Ethics Be Taught?" And she raised right at the beginning an issue that I was challenged with when I first came into this challenge to teach ethics to engineers. She says a case can be made, and many of my colleagues did make this case. A case can be made that ethics are something that you either have or you don't have, or to put it slightly differently, ethics are a code you subscribe to or choose to ignore for reasons of personal interest. All the training and teaching and studying and reading or lectures in ethics will not make a person more ethical if he or she does not have these core values to begin with. That's how she starts off the article. She ends it up in a very different place, and I do as well. But it was fun for me to read someone in 2017 who captured a lot of the ideas that I have gained over my time studying engineering ethics. And I encourage you to read the article if you get a chance. I'll come back to this at the end. But perhaps some of you can remember some engineering disasters, because that's how engineering ethics has been taught for many decades. I don't know if you remember any of these. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse, that was the first. When I started in engineering as a freshman, we all had to study a little bit of that case. There was the Hyatt Regency Hotel walkway collapse, Union Carbide Bhopal gas leak, the Space Shuttle Challenger, that was much more present in my memory and has been studied a lot. I actually teach that still. It's going on 40 years now as a great learning lesson. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and more recently, Boeing 737 MAX crashes. Any other disasters you recall that
Chernobyl.
were? Go ahead.
I said Chernobyl. I think
Yes,
Chernobyl,
Chernobyl, certainly.
master of all disasters.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Fukuyama.
Uh-huh.
Hmm.
Yeah, these disasters are helpful ways to teach engineers not to do bad things or to fail in their engineering. And I think it was very effective as a motivation when you see how many people lose their lives or the value of engineering mistakes or sometimes even intentional. But for the most part, the issue is most engineers don't start out to cause a disaster, right? So why does it keep happening?
Well,
And
the disaster that was overblown was 3 Mile Island.
okay, yeah.
You
I
know,
mean,
And
the
and these
response to
disasters
the, I
happen
mean,
for
yes.
many different reasons. Sometimes it's poor management, sometimes it's poor oversights of engineering challenges and engineering design. Sometimes it's actual just cutting corners and not following process. But I go ahead.
yeah, one thing that I just said, I haven't verified this, but I believe well, I did read a quote that said Sam Altman, Chat GPT, once said that sure, AI can be a future disaster, but in the meantime, a lot of great companies can be formed. And
Please,
if that's true, then I think that's the epitome of immorality and the lack of ethics.
Well,
and it's
I'll just chime in and say yes, he did do that. And he did say
okay.
it, and they're behaving that way.
And I think it's important to realize that maybe as Michael, you pointed out earlier that our current culture suggests to think about the short term and not the long term. And yet what we teach engineers to do is to try to engineer for the long term and to think about those issues early in the process. And I'll come back to that in my talk.
Can,
Um,
can I interject one thing into that, Andrew?
sure.
As long as they're not focused on uh, planned obsolescence, because planned obsolescence is also unethical.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And that to me is a kind of focusing on getting the most capital out of a technology in the short term and not the long term. The whole movement now, and I'm not going to talk about this for a right to repair is intriguing to me. The idea that we should be able to repair the technologies we own.
There are some industries, though, where it is almost necessary to break the code. For example, in medical devices, the only way that many of these medical device companies can make their money is through having replaceable parts.
Yeah.
So
Well,
they,
I am in the medical device industry as a biomedical engineer, so that's going to be an area that I will focus on. But I was challenged when we started this program, and I'll tell you a little bit about my path. What does it even mean to be ethical? And I had to start from what does it mean to be an engineer? Those were some primary questions if I was going to understand how to teach engineering ethics. So I want to start off by saying for ethics, ethics is not just don't do bad things, but I take and I teach from this position that ethics is importantly related to, but different from morality, as well as different from laws and regulations and codes. Ethics is the process of intentional reflection and decision making about what is the right and best or optimized action in a given specific situation. So I'm going to say that one more time because I want it to stick with us. Ethics is the process of intentional reflection and decision making about what is the right and best optimal action in a given specific situation. And you might see from that definition that there's some overlap with engineering. in that sense. Both are related to processes of intentional reflection, decision, and eventually design. So the reason I say it's different is that morals and values often come from several places, including religion and society. They can vary with culture, geography, and then within those specific areas, the laws that are set up by the government and the agents that control societal practices, they are overlapping often the morals and values that exist in that culture. And then as professionals, we set up codes of ethics which collectively guide our action as a professional. All of these are essential and valuable to helping decide what is the right and best optimal action. But when it comes down to a specific situation, sometimes those laws, those morals, and even those codes are either in conflict or they sit in a situation where they're not clear what the actual best optimal action is. And that's where this intentional reflection and decision making of ethics needs to come in. And this is where I began to think about, well, how then do you teach this to engineers? So I also asked this question, well, what is it to do engineering? What's the purpose? And how can we use that as a guide for ethical engineering? Here's one view that came up recently in an engineering education statement.
Andrew,
Yes.
I like your definition, but it's missing one element, which is
Oh, yes.
when there's a lot of opposing forces on you while you're doing your analysis, et cetera, et cetera.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
I worked in the safety business for many years in a large consulting firm, then on my own. And most plant manager would say, what can you do that costs nothing?
Uh-huh.
Basically, they don't want to do anything. And one of the recommendation that I used to say to plant managers, US overseas, involved in oil and gas operation, where the hazard is very high, is if you live on the plant, safety will improve. And they never liked that from me. And it's really, and also when you work as a consultant, you could do analysis for a client, but if the client doesn't like it very much, there's a lot of pressure on you to modify the conclusions. And I can give
Absolutely.
you lots of examples, very specific, not as big as natural disaster, but very important to engineers because that's really what people go through. Small decisions where you can be ethical or not, etc., and the consequence, of course.
Absolutely, Albert. The idea that engineers are not operating in a vacuum, they're operating in a particular context and often under serious constraints to their ethical practice is an essential part of where I have arrived as well. So thank you for raising that. And I want to apologize. I realized my slides were not advancing, even though I was advancing them on my side. They're not advancing in the Zoom. So I think I've caught us up here.
Okay.
Sorry about that. So yes, I wanted to just talk about this idea that the purpose of engineering, the development and application of scientific and technical knowledge to the discovery, creation, and mentoring of technologies capable of transforming human societies and environments for increased well-being and life quality, and hence necessarily following sustainability and equity principles. There are many ways to describe engineering, but I captured that one because it resonated with me and the ways I think about what engineers, particularly these biomedical engineers who are designing, developing, and deploying medical technologies, need to be thinking about as part of their purpose. So in order to become effective at an education of engineers in ethics, I wanted to understand what's ethics competency. What do biomedical engineers, and eventually broadening that out to all engineers, what do they need to know to be ethical in their engineering practice? So here's the outline of the rest of my talk. I want to cover today. I'll go as fast as I can. I want to talk a little bit about my path into engineering ethics education, some initial attempts at teaching, building on many others who've gone before me, engineering a foundation with principles and pedagogy that we developed as part of our teaching, some research that we were testing whether our new foundation of principles and pedagogy was working. Then we studied a little bit about the ethical experiences of engineers in the health products industry, one I'm linked to. We realized we needed to integrate some more tools into our pedagogy, and then we wanted to understand the ethical experiences of engineering faculty who are teaching the ethics in many cases. And I'll conclude with some lessons learned to summarize. So advancing here, I started out, I'm not formally trained in any ethics, but while I was doing my bachelor's, I studied some philosophy of science and educational psychology. I wanted to be a STEM educator. I ended up at Purdue doing my PhD and in biomedical research area and experiencing some difficult ethical challenges around animal research, around publication ethics. I went to pharmaceutical industry as a postdoc, and I was in the biotechnology area. It was there that I really experienced how industry handled ethical decision making in the 80s when in the early 90s when I was there. Pharmaceutical industry was having some scandals, and companies were trying to decide how to repair their reputation. And there was a big challenge around the idea of stem cell technology, which at that point Lilly was trying to develop as well, and I was involved in some of the early work around that. But the question that I kept coming to is, why are the people making the decisions in leadership not talking to the engineers and scientists who were working with the technology? They were consulting with marketers and legal people about decisions they should make. And I realized there that it wasn't because the engineers and scientists didn't have opinions, but it was about the idea that often they did not have the language or the experience of talking about the ethical values in order to contribute broadly to this conversation. And so I took from that this idea that teaching engineers needs to include having the right language and the understanding of ethics from a perspective that they can use their technical expertise to contribute to a conversation. I came back to Purdue as a senior researcher in a new research area. There was some significant ethical experiences with leadership in that area that actually led to a faculty member being removed from the university. So I saw firsthand how people who are trying to do very good things in developing technology can get led astray by various temptations, as Albert pointed out, or pressures from external forces. I did a stint as a biotech consultant there while I was working with a couple of startup companies in our research incubator system that's associated with the university. I learned that what I initially thought as constraints or frustrations in innovation from the risk management team and from the regulatory affairs team actually turned out to be useful in getting better ethical design, more ethical design. And I'll talk about that a little bit in the future. But this idea that ethics can actually be a driver of innovation and better engineering. And finally, I came to this new department that was forming at Purdue in biomedical engineering and was helping design a new curriculum. And from my background, I said, well, we have to teach these new engineers about ethics. They can't go out into the world without learning some ethics. And so it was one of those, well, you brought it up, so you are going to teach it now. And I had to figure out how I was going to do that. And that's how I got started. My initial attempts into teaching these engineers drew from several people that I want to call out as my teachers and mentors. Jerry Collins, a Purdue alum, was then at Vanderbilt University. He was has been an inspirational mentor for me from the beginning. He was part of an early engineering research center that was developing a taxonomy for this emerging field of biomedical engineering. And he was the one who was focusing biomedical engineering curriculum on including ethics. So a pioneer in that area. And he published several papers. He was part of the Biomedical Engineering Society's first group, their ethics group that established their code of ethics for our society. So he had a lot of influence both on the society and on me as a young ethics educator. Dr. Rosalind Pincus, who was at Pittsburgh at the time in the Institute for Bioethics, she had written a book on engineering ethics that put two pieces together for me that were very helpful. This idea of professional ethics and the principles from biomedical ethics. So professional engineering and principles of biomedical ethics seemed like a good fit for biomedical engineers, and I think for engineers of all stripes to be thinking about. So the principles of biomedical ethics, if I can just talk about them for a minute, because they become center in my teaching, come from years of research on biomedical research and ethics of biomedical research. Tom Beecham and Jim Childress wrote the original Principles of Biomedical Engineering in '79, and later a paper called Four Principles Approach helped explain that these four principles from common morality can really help us think about how we can evaluate the ethics issues in any sort of case. Those principles, some of you may know, are beneficence, to do good, non-maleficence, to not do harm, to respect for autonomy, giving individuals choice and freedom and respect their dignity, and finally justice, or particularly the just distribution of potential for benefit and potential for harm. They had this process that they described in which the principles, the four principles of common morality, had to be processed through several steps, because principles are just groups of values. They don't tell you what to do. So you have to specify them first by understanding stakeholder perspectives within whatever situation or case you're in. Then you have to prioritize which principles or values are going to have the most sway by weighing and balancing, negotiating among those principles. And then finally, coming to some kind of coherence and justification among these specified and balanced principles towards an articulated ethical action. This has been the process for biomedical ethics for the last few decades, and others, some have taken it even further, but I use that as an initial foundation for helping me understand how to teach ethics to biomedical engineer. Two other people who are significant in my understanding of ethics were Margaret Eaton, who was a PhD and JD from Stanford School of Business, director at the Center for Biomedical Ethics. She was here at Purdue, and I invited her to give my first workshop. I invited her as a guest speaker. She was working with the pharmaceutical industry and preparing this book that came out in 2007 called Innovation in Medical Technology, Ethical Issues and Challenges. And that book really, and her talk really helped me think about this idea that ethics issues don't need to stymie innovation. They can actually become drivers of innovation if you think about them early on. She said something to me that has stuck with me. She said in all of her work in litigation with the pharmaceutical industry, she said 80% of the issues and the cases that came up probably could have been resolved if they had been addressed early in the process, before the drugs were developed, before the testing had gone that down the road. The problem was once it gets that far down the road, then it's a costly and complicated issue to try to resolve. If you think about them as design principles ahead of in the process of thinking about your testing protocol and your development protocol, they can become drivers of new innovation. The other person I want to give a shout out to is Nancy Tuana from Penn State. Dr. Tuana was the director of the Rocks Ethics Institute, and she studied something she called moral literacy and ethical development, particularly for education. Her 2007 paper has been, I encourage my students to read that, about moral literacy and the elements that go into it. She was building her case, and subsequently I did as well, on some early work in moral development that was by James Rest and Darcia Navres. They had a 4-component model of moral development. So they were asking, how do you develop moral behavior? What's the process? And they were looking at it over a lifespan, but they came to these 4 components that are interactive and integrated. One is this element of moral sensitivity. The second is moral judgment.
Mosaic browser introduced.
The third is a moral motivation. The fourth is implementation. So you could see these as sort of steps, but more importantly, they were understood as a developmental process by which people become more ethical or have a stronger motivation towards moral behavior. It involves both these skills and character as well. This became foundational for my understanding of how to teach ethics, to have this initial framework of the 4-step process and the 4 principles. Here's a fun from their original paper where they talked about the 4 components, and they identified, to help people understand them, they identified people who were either high in that component or were weak in that component. You might recognize some of these people going back quite a ways. How we detect moral sensitivity, moral judgment, moral motivation, and implementation. So Nancy Tuana took this 4-component model. She actually condensed it down to a 3-component model, because many at the time said, well, you can't really teach people to do the implementation. And there's an old statement, Midwestern, I learned it from a Midwestern storyteller, about how do you teach a cat to fetch the morning paper? And he goes on to say, the way you teach a cat to fetch the morning paper is you bring your cat out to the porch each morning, you get down on your hands and knees, and you crawl out and you pick up the paper in your mouth, you bring it back and you drop it in front of the cat. And after you do that for about a week, the cat will know exactly how to fetch the morning paper. They probably will never do it, but they will know exactly how it's done. And so this issue was how ethics was sort of being taught. It's like, okay, here's how you do this, and whether or not you do it is kind of up to you. I think we have to move beyond that. And but at the time, that was the element in which folks were looking at. What are the elements that people needed to know in order to be able to move forward, to have some competency? So this component that Nancy Tuana took from, I call it ethics competency model. It involved moral literacy as a multifaceted set of skills, including sensitivity, reasoning, and moral imagination, that were interconnected and could be learned best in combination. But it must be crafted and honed with practice. This moral literacy components each had components that could be developed individually, but as she said, they are best developed as a unit. So ethics sensitivity, this ability to identify whether something is an ethical issue, she recognized is not an inborn talent, but one that can be developed and can be also blunted or diminished. As I think Albert pointed out, that if you're in a context where ethics are being diminished or ignored, your ethics sensitivity can decrease. The ethics sensitivity, as she pointed out, had 3 components that needed to be developed: the ability to identify if an ethics issue was involved, and the ability to assess the moral intensity of that particular issue, and the ability to identify the values, virtues, and principles that underlie that particular ethics issue. Ethics, that's ethics sensitivity. Ethics reasoning, something that I think engineers do particularly well because we're trained to do this kind of pragmatic reasoning. Ethics reasoning requires an integrated approach to analysis. It evaluates intensity as scope and scale and specificity. It also has three components: this ability to identify the relevance of particular facts and assumptions that are involved in the case, the ethics issue, the ability to assess the relevance and differing values and perspectives of a wide variety of stakeholders, and the ability to use various ethics frameworks to analyze and select the most relevant, effective ethical action. So the third piece that she saw in this development of an ethical disposition, or what I call ethics competency, is the ability to ethical imagination, the ability to imaginally discern various possibilities for acting and the potential outcomes. To me, this aligned quite closely with an idea of an ethics design or an engineering design process. It has several ways to be engaged. This involves empathy for the feelings, desires, and values of others, the ability to consider creative alternatives, and a certain level of moral commitment and courage to that particular outcome or action. These three components, the ethical sensitivity, ethical reasoning, ethical imagination, work according to this model in a process that also looks a little bit like an engineering design process. It's a cyclical process that takes you around from initially identifying the ethical issues, determining the underlying values and their intensity, assessing the facts, considering the consequences, identifying the relevant virtues, the possible duties, the issues of care, the values that are involved, and using a moral imagination to come up with an aspect of ethical action. So these are the kinds of cognitive analytical processes that need to go into moral or ethical literacy, according to Nancy Tawana. This aligned very well with a second model I found in these early days, which is Caroline Whitbeck's, an ethicist who wrote a lot about engineering ethics. She wrote a core paper in 1996 as part of the Hastings Center reports. It's called Ethics as Design, Doing Justice to Moral Problems. She made two really insightful arguments there, and I have my students read this paper as well as a seminal piece. She said, solving ethical problems is not just about choosing the best among possible alternatives. I often say to the students, it's not just an either or, which is the worst or the better of the two options. You need to be creative about what might be a possible third option. She says solving ethics problems is not about choosing the best among possible options, but rather includes devising, or in my terms, designing new options for response. And design practice in engineering affords an important lesson about addressing these practical problems. She saw ethics problems as practical problems that engineers could effectively solve. Another person who saw ethics as critical in engineering and helped us understand the place of codes of ethics in the practice of a profession was Michael Davis, another professional ethicist who wrote this paper, Thinking Like an Engineer. He was analyzing the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster, but his main focus was on how important having a professional code of ethics is for professionals, and engineers as professionals needed a code, not because it guided it, not only because it guided their particular action, but it helped defend them against pressures from the outside. As we talked about earlier, they had an opportunity to reference the collective wisdom of the profession. He also recognized here the importance of the public, and the early codes of ethics really leaned into this idea, the paramountcy clause of the primary effort of an engineer is to protect and preserve the safety and well-being of the public. But what does it mean to be the public? And this was part of his challenge, and part of the challenge I bring to my students is how do you interpret who's the public and how is their well-being and safety best addressed in this case? So these were some of the ways that I had gathered before when I was starting to figure out how to teach ethics. And what I realized at that time was these are lots of good pieces. How do we put them together into a comprehensive framework and a pedagogy to be able to teach a holistic approach to ethics education in engineering? And I was asking at that point, primarily for my own course that I was trying to teach in biomedical engineering, but I drew from my colleagues in multiple disciplines here, and we began to look at this from a perspective of ethics education across engineering disciplines. So we started in 2010. I started in 2010 with a collaboration with then a young PhD student, Jonathan Beaver. Jonathan is now a professor at University of Central Florida and the founding director of their ethics center. I was also working with Justin Hess, another PhD student at Purdue, who's now a professor at Purdue in engineering education, and Carla Zoltowski, who at the time was a professor in electrical and computer engineering and now also an engineering education professor. These were my initial colleagues. We wanted to work together to develop a foundational framework and a pedagogy. We called that framework reflexive principlism. Particularly Jonathan Beaver was core to understanding this. It's a framework that is built on the 4 principles of biomedical ethics. It includes codes and cases in an iterative ethical decision-making process, and it uses the idea of framed as ethics as design. This framework really emphasized empathic perspective taking for stakeholder analysis, really understanding the perspective of all the people involved, but using a human-centered or universal design process. And we built this framework into 3 stages with 6 steps, and I'm going to describe a little bit about it in the next few slides. Oops. So this reflexive principlism as a core or foundational framework for ethical decision-making is built on principlism, which comes from Beecham and Childress principles of biomedical ethics I've already described. We found it expressly relevant to biomedical engineers, but it really, because they work at the intersection of medicine and engineering, but it really seemed applicable to all engineering disciplines because it starts from these principles of common morality. These principles, as I mentioned, are beneficence or to do good. I think I have another. These principles are beneficence to do good, non-maleficence to do no harm, respect for autonomy, which is the principle of respecting the individual and their choice and their dignity, and finally justice, a fair distribution of risk, potential for risk and potential for harm and for benefit. Noting that in the medical technologies area, biomedical engineering, the idea of beneficence and non-maleficence is really the basis for the FDA's regulatory oversight of medical technologies. They measure effectiveness and safety. They evaluate the risk and they evaluate the benefit. There's less emphasis on this idea of respect for autonomy and justice, but that has become even more important in the last decade for regulation of medical technologies, that we can get fair distribution of these health benefits and distribution of risk as well. And as we talked about early, maybe a little before the program started, this idea that we need to consider the full time frame of ethics issues, not just the short term, but the long-term impacts as well. We need to consider the full life cycle of a technology, from the research stage to the design stage to development, through deployment, adaptation, and retirement, which addresses this issue of early retirement or obsolescence as maybe not the most ethical, or having disposable parts or having other components that may not be the most ethical approach. So we wove all these pieces together into reflexive principlism to help have a coherent framework for engineers to start to learn from. The reason we use principles, I like this slide that Dr. Beaver set up, is that teaching ethics from the abstract theories of ethicists, even though he is a philosophy student and an ethicist of himself, was not useful for most engineering students. They did not understand the abstractions. The other process of teaching lots of cases became time consuming. If you have to study 10 or 20 or 30 cases to understand a basic principle of what is an ethical decision, then that uses a lot of time. We found the idea that principles could be much more efficient. And because engineers start their engineering education from first principles to begin with, this idea that first principles of ethics could be a great place for engineers to start. And finally, principles are how we derive. The principles are the filter through which the cases are distilled into effective professional code. So we wanted the students to understand where the codes came from by looking at the principles. And this seemed like a core element to developing a better framework for ethics education. This reflexive principlism, we call it reflexive principlism because there's a mode of reasoning called reflective equilibrium in which you're looking at cases, principles, and codes around particular decision, and you're doing it over and over again in an interactive way until it becomes a reflexive process. It takes practice to do this kind of reflexive equilibrium and reasoning process, but engineers, this is how they learn to do design, by doing multiple cases and practicing their design cases. So we incorporated this into this process. And we used the basic principles, the process for ethical reasoning of Beecham and Childress to help give the engineering students a stepwise process in which you identify the principles, you specify the principles from multiple stakeholder perspectives, and then you negotiate, weighing and balancing those conflicts among those principles and values, finally justifying and understanding which appropriate value structures help come up with an action that maximizes the optimal ethical action. We expanded on this basic idea to have reflexive principles of having these three stages: ethics awareness, ethics analysis, and ethics action. And each of those have multiple steps based on those principles. So now we have this framework of ethical process for ethical competency, but and the final piece was this is Jonathan Beaver, who we added this element of ethics reasoning as a design process, as we saw earlier. We wanted to integrate reflective analysis into a design process, an iterative and integrative design process that, with related experience, could be practiced by engineers in the same way that they learn to practice their design process, and then could become reflexive, a reflex in their dealing with ethical issues. So now we had this approach, and we wanted to know, does this process actually work? We had developed it over several years. We wanted to know if it would actually work to teach engineers more about ethics. So we applied for an NSF, National Science Foundation Engineering in Ethics and Science grant that funded a study of using reflexive principlism in a pedagogy called the SIRA pedagogy that we developed. Our big question at the time was, can we teach ethics online as well as we teach it in class? I don't know how many of you have thought about the possibility of teaching ethics online, but it was a big push at this time. Oh, you should make your ethics, there's not enough time in the classroom, so teach your ethics online with an asynchronous course where people can just sign up and do it on their own. Well, we were curious if that was even possible, because the way we had been teaching it was in class with discussion. So we developed this grant, and the National Science Foundation gave us some money to develop these 4 online learning modules, which we actually developed using a film crew with student actors. We had live discussions that we recorded. We had multimedia content, readings, questions, reflections, and quizzes as they developed through these 4 cases. The question was, would that work to teach in class as well as online? We wanted to know if our pedagogy and our framework actually worked. The pedagogy that used the reflexive principlism was a SIRA, and we developed this. It's a scaffolded, interactive, reflective analysis of cases. And we did this in a cyber-enabled learning infrastructure to see if we could develop moral reasoning and empathy for engineers. The question we were asking really was, can we teach ethics to online engineering students? And we developed an approach that included this SIRA scaffolded pedagogy with the reflexive principlism framework. We assessed how their development of ethical reasoning. One of our colleagues on the team was developing actually an assessment tool for measuring development of ethical reasoning, and another was developing an empathy tool, but we used one that was already validated on this particular study. And we also asked about the satisfaction and the engagement of these students with, sorry, I got behind here. The satisfaction and engagement of these engineering students as a proxy for persistence and a potential to transfer their ethics learning skills into new situations once they left the classroom. So why include empathy in our study? That was an important question at the time. We recognized one of our colleagues is a scholar of empathy in engineering, has published many papers, Dr. Justin Hess, that empathy is instrumental in bringing about a motivated action. So empathy enables people to understand how others see the world. It helps make perspective taking of other stakeholders who are different from you, and it helps you connect with them emotionally. That actually became a driver for ethical action, a motivator for ethical action, and important to how people see the world and think about the ethical situations. Being able to consider how others might see it was an important part. Empathy has 2 components, a cognitive and an affective component. It improves our attitudes, and particularly the literature said that perspective taking is an essential component for ethical reasoning, and we wanted to include that in our measurements. The SIRA model that we developed, I want to just briefly touch on this, was a complex pedagogical approach to teaching ethics. I still use this 6 stages: building with establishing knowledge, developing empathic stakeholder perspective taking, comparing and contrasting both opinions by experts as well as lay people, inducing conflict by understanding the different ethical principles in their context, and then articulating and justifying. And the final step of reflection is part of this iterative process. If you get to an ethical decision and you say, oh, this seems like it might not be perfect, can we go back through this process again? It's an optimization process to get to the best optimized ethical action. This was our approach that we were using to test if the reflexive principlism process could really improve students' ethical reasoning and development, as well as their empathy. And we use these 4 cases in the 4 modules. I mentioned already the Hyatt Hotel Skywalk disaster and Deepwater Horizon were 2 of the cases. We also did a case on tissue engineered heart valves. That's my area of technical expertise. How do you develop pediatric heart valves using tissue engineering? And another one that involved a diagnostic device for osteopenia, a bone disease. what we wanted was to cover the four principles. We wanted to cover different scopes of impact, including humans, animals, culture, environment. We wanted to cover different disciplines of engineering and applied ethics, and in different time frames. So the Hyatt was a historical case. The Deepwater Horizon was happening at that moment. It was live and in the news when we were developing this. The tissue engineered heart valve was an emerging technology, not in place yet, but in research. And then the diagnostic device was a recent technology, kind of a startup situation. So we wanted to cover all these aspects so that students could see how ethics worked throughout the different phases of technology development. With these cases in place, we did a number of measurements. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly to measure their ethical reasoning, their interactivity, how the scaffolding works, how their reflection analysis works. And we published a couple of papers on these. The outcomes of this early research were quite positive. We found that ethical reasoning, development of ethical reasoning was increased with this learning intervention. And we found that using these particular filmed modules with live discussions, recorded discussions, could really work as well in an online format as well as in class. The ethical reasoning using the reflexive principlism framework also increased. We had a specific test for that, and that was as good online as was in class. And finally, empathic perspective taking also increased with this learning intervention. We studied this over a 3-year period with multiple classes of students, both in present and also online asynchronously. And the students reported that one of the important learnings was that they experienced cognitive dissonance from these diverse team discussions. It really increased their ethical awareness and reasoning skills. So there was something we didn't plan for, but having teams with very different backgrounds and perspectives in conversation, they had to work through this as a team. It recognized an element, they recognized an element that was challenging their ways of thinking about ethics. I'll pause here. Marv, you have your hand up. Thank you. What's your question?
Hold on 1 second. Well, it's actually, it may be more appropriate to do this at the end. I want to present a real world problem that I wrestled with 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, where I believe at the time I made the right decision, and in retrospect made the wrong decision that in fact has impacted most of the people on this planet. So I'd rather probably wait for that till the end of the presentation, because it could be
That
relevant.
sounds really juicy. I want to hear about it, but let's, wait till the end. I want to tell you a little bit more about our continued research, and then I'll save some time. Albert, did you have a question too?
Yes. Andrew, your presentation is very nice. I guess you're looking at the theoretical basis of how to teach ethical. I have an alternate approach.
Okay.
Based on the fact that I've been a professional engineer for many years and had to deal with a lot of ethical issues at every step. So the approach I propose is, when you're teaching students, at the end of every problem set, you raise an ethical question. So here, to implement that, it's not teaching the student, it's teaching the faculty, the teachers, how to inspire or really invoke ethical discussion. And that's very easy. And of course, I was exposed on that in safety a lot. You could see a natural ethical issue that comes up. But even in regular engineering, let's say you need to calculate an efficiency of something. The final question is, okay, given that you calculated X, what if your company wants really higher than X? Likewise, in your bioengineering things, so you developed a device, and according to that, the specificity of the FDA could be Y, but Y is not good enough. You calculated Y minus 20. How do you handle the situation? Uh, I think safety is another example of you cannot teach it in a vacuum.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I think there've been attempt on that, probably, I don't know, um, to say, okay, you build that, what if it breaks?
Yes.
So that's a safety issue. Now, ethics could be like that, where it's not what will it break, but what if the implication is the failure of the company that's trying to sell this? So what would you do? Uh, would that make sense? Is that doable, that approach I'm talking about?
It is absolutely, and it's very timely, Albert. So I just want to say thank you for that insight because we got to this end of trying to understand from an educational theory how was the best way to teach ethics, and we even developed this scaffolded process, and we had these cases that we taught, and we measured lots of things. But the question that we ended up with was, well, does that actually align with how engineers experience actual practice in industry? So we had a theory, and just as you pointed out, well, did that align in some way with the way that engineers were actually doing it? And so, because my area is in health products industry, biomedical, we got another grant, and we tried to ask that question. Was the way we were teaching ethics in academia that we tested, was it actually aligning with ethical professional practice? And this is the team that studied that. We went to interview over about 4 dozen engineers from a wide range of their experiences from, I think, the youngest was 1 year to 39 years. They were in the fields of cardiovascular, orthopedic, pharmaceutical, and general medical health products. And we asked them a series of questions, an hour and a half interview with each of them. We're actually two strategies of interviews. And we analyzed those interviews to determine what could we learn about the actual ethical experiences of these engineers in practice. I want to tell you a little about the results, but I see that several people have their hands up. Michael or Eddie, I don't know who's first.
Let's go to Eddie first. That's good.
Yes, I have a number of comments, I guess, because in my own career, I've come across ethical problems that were great issues. The first was during the Reagan administration when they were about to do Star Wars, and my company really wanted to get involved with it. At the same time, I was working with a company, not a company, an association called the Canadian Association for Future Studies, which was associated with a think tank called the Gamma Institute, which at the time saw, well, actually, it's also the Department of National Defense in Ottawa, who saw that the whole Star Wars thing was actually against Canadian interests. Worse than that, it was also considered among Canadian engineers and scientists, for the most part, as being unethical. So I wound up having a big battle with my company president as a consequence. And he threatened me with my job, but he couldn't get rid of me at the time. It took him 10 years. Another case was at my last employer. I guess I would say I shouldn't really talk about it, but I discovered I made an error in some calculations that actually was company-wide necessary to correct. And my
Mm.
boss at the time told me, I don't want you to change anything. But I said, well, if I don't, then the company runs a higher risk of certain failures. It has to be corrected. It turned out that the VPs actually wanted me to make those changes and weren't going to shoot me in the head, but my boss actually tried to do
Hmm.
that.
Well, I think you will see I think you will see, Eddie, some of those examples in what we uncovered in the health products industry. I know that wasn't your area, but when we interviewed these 4 dozen, almost 4 dozen engineers and studied their responses, what we found were there were 6 categories of different ways people, the engineers, were experiencing ethics in their engineering practice. And they're in this graph here showing their a hierarchical grouping, with the first category down in the lower left there, about doing right, which we might all understand as the basics of ethics. Are you following the protocol? Are you doing the right thing? Do you have the safety protocols in place? Are you following the codes and the compliance? The second group were really experiencing, and as you might understand, most of those folks in the doing right category were new engineers, and they were on the line or they were setting up systems. The next group, the ensuring integrity in the process, they were asking, well, is this protocol the right protocol? Are we doing the right tests? It's not just about doing them right, but are we doing the right ones? And are they doing in the right way? So that there was a second layer. But in both of these cases of protocols and processes, those engineers were pretty much accepting that the system was working as it should be. They were accepting that they were carrying out their engineering duties appropriately. The next tier was the engineers who were experiencing ethics in their practice with some questioning. And it sounds like you got into that realm, Eddie. This idea that I have a professional responsibility to look at the details from an engineering perspective, to ask the hard questions. Does that data actually line up? Does it align with the needs of both the technology as well as the stakeholders? And the other group were really about understanding multiple stakeholders, both from within the engineering group, within the company, within finance, within business, and also, in this case, within hospitals and clinicians and patients. So they were this group that was trying to understand various perspectives on the case and saying ethical engineering is about getting all those perspectives involved. The final group were the ones that we called benefiting. They were benefiting a system, both at the industry culture and in the corporate culture, as well as the industry ecosystem. And they involved negotiating among really hard decisions. So problems that would come up, ethical choices where values were in conflict. Do you make a recall when you know a device or a technology is not working well? When do you make the recall? How do you move a product forward without enough, when you don't have enough information, but getting it to market would really advance healthcare or save patients' lives? And finally, the group that was mostly made up of leaders or managers, they considered ethical engineering practice as a way of stewarding an ethical culture, to support the people who are working with them, to hear their concerns, their complaints, their understandings, and to make sure that the culture supported ethical behavior. These 6 categories of ways of experiencing in these 2 dimensions were really important for us to understand how do engineers in the health products industry experience ethical engineering.
I guess my question, though, has a little bit more about not just simply integrity, but what you're willing to pay for that integrity.
Sure.
Example, if I was threatened with my job, I actually battled quite hard for what I considered to be ethical behavior
Yes.
and integrity.
Yes.
And I think the question also comes down to, your own personal circumstances,
Yes.
families to support and so forth. So at what point, so there's always this trade-off, which is very difficult. So
Absolutely.
people for that trade-off, I think, is part of the whole process too.
Yeah. And we found that we started to ask the questions like, how do these engineers, when they're facing those trade-offs, how are they influenced? What kind of incidents around their personal experiences were helping them to make those ethical decisions? And right in the center were this reflection on the ethical situation, their ability to think through and ask questions and talk with people about an ethical situation. which is something I think engineers do very well when they're given the time to do that and when they're given the space and not pressured. The other elements around that were maybe more obviously some ethics training, mentorship from senior engineers who could help them make that right decision, interpersonal encounters with people who were encouraging them to be ethical or to think about a problem in a different way. Then there were acting ethically, which was either them doing it themselves and experiencing it, or seeing someone acting ethically and seeing the outcomes, or ethical failures, where they saw somebody do it in unethically and what happened, or they're making the wrong choice themselves. And the final piece of this set of critical incidents was the culture that they were immersed in. And it sounds like, Eddie, the culture you were immersed in at that point was not really supporting your ethical decision making. And so the engineers in industry told us that it was really a huge influence in how they perceived their ability to be an ethical engineer. And so we dug in a little further and we started looking at what was the elements of the organizational culture that really supported or inhibited ethical behavior by engineers. They could know what the right thing to do was, but were they going to be able to do it in the context? How much support did they have? And we realized that the individual had a particular set of values, the engineering values, this is the gold part there. The engineering group had its own set of values that included economics, and other fiduciary values, include engineering technology values and process values. But then there was the organizational culture that they were working in. That engineering context was embedded in a larger company culture, which was ultimately embedded in a larger industry environment. And all of those tiers were putting pressure on individual or groups of engineers to make the right decision. This became a key part of our understanding that we need to prepare engineers to go into this pressure cooker of an engineering world to learn how to deal with these pressures ahead of time. And
Andrew, I have a suggestion.
yes,
I'm very sensitive to the time because I know a lot of people will drop off as we get close to noon, and it's
okay,
almost and there's clearly a great deal of interest. So number one thought is we have to have you come back at some point. And
okay.
and in the fall, I think, because our program is we'll end our program in June. But what I'd like to do to close this session, and I need to close it by at the least, at the latest, 15 minutes after the hour. So
Okay.
why don't we, if you would agree to this, I'd like to hear from there are three hands up at the moment. I'd like to have those hands listened to, and I'd like to
Hmm.
close the session with Marv's comment because I think that was an important.
I'd
I think
actually, I must say, I've waited 30 years to bring this up in a group like this.
good.
Seriously. So
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd like to reclaim my primacy because of the time issue.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Let's go ahead. All
Okay,
right.
so
Let's do that.
a few of you know about this. I
Okay.
I filed a patent in 19 I came up with it in 1994 that got me the title among certain people of the father of surveillance economics, and I'll explain that. I knew when I came up with this, it was both potentially very positive, that was my goal, and to be honest, lucrative, and also dangerous. So I have to set the stage. In 1994, email was
Jesus.
available to basically two groups of people in the world. Those who were working for a government, large organization, or industry, or I should say a university, and they could communicate with each other. It was highly technical, and they couldn't easily communicate across um, institutions. The other way was by buying a license to AOL, CompuServe, Prodigy, which you got a lot of other stuff and didn't just give you email. And so I wanted to give email away for free. And obviously the economics of it were difficult. And I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how we could go about doing that. I was an executive in a subsidiary of the major internet player at the time, CMGI, and What I came up with was the idea that um, you could add support. I know that sounds so obvious now. Add support it, but in a way that had never been done before. Advertising prior to that had always been serial. You looked at something, then you looked at something else. And I realized that the only way in which this would become a valuable new way of communicating or advertising would be with much more specificity, much more parallelism than serialism. And essentially, I invented the banner advertising. I'd be happy to post the patent filing up on for everybody. It lays out everything that has been done. I knew immediately when I came up with the idea because I would be capturing data on individual, and in fact, people would tell me what they were interested in, so that we could direct ads to them. I'd know if they were in a car buying mode, and therefore we would feed them a Ford ad in a banner with the ability to respond. I knew that was dangerous. On the other hand, I knew we'd be able to
Yeah,
give
you,
free email away to anybody who wanted it in the world. Hello, I hear background. So
Yeah.
I wrestled. It was on a Sunday night in November. I remember it as clearly as possible in 1994. My wife and I sat up for hours because I knew that on the one hand, I could give away free communications. On the other hand, I would know more about people than they knew about themselves. That was clear to me that night. And my wife asked me two questions. She said, "Will somebody else come up with this?" In fact, yes, I knew. I figured people would, and in fact, found out afterwards other people had come up with similar ideas. And the second question was, are people better off with the free communications anybody could use? It was very simplistic. Got to realize this was only a year after Mosaic was introduced to the world. The first browser, which was very rudimentary. And I came to the conclusion that, yeah, people were better off than the risk, but it was sort of tainted by the knowledge that this was also a very big idea with a lot of money attached to it. And I was an entrepreneur in nature. And so that filing has been cited if you look at it online, you'll see it, by 250 companies, including IBM, Snap, you name it, as how, in a sense, I was one of the people who taught the world how to do the capturing of information, precise data on people in exchange for free email, turn them into inventory. I wrestled with that. It is why I've spent the last 30 years basically trying to compensate for my decision. I don't know how I could have approached it differently, except to shut myself down. But my nature was to create and bring things out. And I think that's the other side of this story. It's not systemic, it's not organizational, it's very personal, trying to project a future that's very difficult to project.
That's an interesting history. Yeah. That you know, it seems to me though, it was personal. I want Andrew to answer, but just an observation. It seems to me you made a decision based on what you thought was best for the people. It wasn't
I
because you
have to be
wanted.
honest, I thought it was best for me too. I was biased. This was my
But
baby.
were you? I mean, if you consider that in the context of today's decisions by the Altmans of the world, who know that their technology is dangerous, but they know they're going to get rich doing it, don't you think yours was a totally different situation, or am I misjudging it?
I can't say totally different. Maybe different in extent, but I don't know that it was different in kind. I
Okay,
have to be
okay,
honest about it. I understand what
yeah, yeah, yeah.
motivates these people.
Well, Andrew, what is your comment on Marv's discussion?
Marv, thank you for sharing that with us. And it is obvious, it is absolutely a story that I have heard from other engineers, particularly those who are at the forefront of innovation. I think that is the most difficult place to keep to make ethical decisions, because you are out in a space where you're not sure what the future is. And one of my colleagues is studying startup ethics of innovators. It's the most difficult place when you have a new technology and you don't know the unintended consequences or the intended consequences. The one thing that I encourage my students is a guide that try not to make any ethical decisions solo. And I appreciate you went to your most trusted advisor or your most trusted person in your wife. I encourage our students to go even broader than that and try to get multiple perspectives on it. Now, when they're an engineer in a time crunch, as you were you had to make a decision at that moment and you don't have the information that you need, which often happens. You don't have all the future perspectives. You just have to make the best you can and go with it. But otherwise, trying to get as many people who could be wise
Well, the
insight
interesting
into it.
thing was when I presented it to my team the next day, we were in a patent office by the end of that day.
Mm.
And the Dave Wetherell, who name means something to you guys, at one point Gillette Stadium was called CMGI, so it was the major player. They completely jumped over the idea, jumped on it, and saw it as the future of everything. And
Yeah.
I sat there, thinking, what have I done? And it didn't take very long. I got no pushback at all from anybody in terms of the implications of it, and I kept bringing it up.
Well, that must have been the right decision to make at the time then.
At the time.
From an
And that's
economic point of view, it certainly
that's an
was.
important qualifier at the time.
At the time, that's all we can do, right?
It took me all of 6 months to realize the level of danger that had been
Mm.
created.
But I don't want to jump. I'm going to take too much of everybody else's time, but I keep thinking of the current AI generation. Let's go on to Michael
But
and
I'll just say I
okay.
posted the link if anybody wants to look at it, and if you do
Yes,
look
yes,
at
yes,
it,
yes.
take a
Okay.
look at the PDF that's downloadable on that site, which will show you exactly how banners could work, and it did, and I did that in 1994. And
Mhm.
Marv,
again, it's
yeah,
not patting myself on the back; it's saying
yeah.
I regret it.
Send it to me, Mark, and I'll circulate it if
Well,
you
then
want.
I posted it, and I'll send
Oh,
it.
you
I
okay.
posted it in the chat.
Okay. Okay. We got a few more minutes, so let's go to Michael and then Tom and Avi will have the last word. Go ahead, Michael.
I can appreciate what Ed said, and what Marvin said about pushback from the administration on doing what was right. I have to say that, and we know that cigarette companies knew about cancer long before it became public. Exxon knew about climate change, and it's great that we can teach engineers to be ethical. But as Marvin and Eddie saw, that once you get into the corporate entity, whether you're ethical or not, they determine whether you're going to be able to act ethically. So there's pressure. My feeling is, it's not even a feeling, I know that the way to solve the problem is to eliminate the pressure. And the pressure is coming from the fact that it is a legal requirement of the corporation to produce maximum profits and maximum growth for the investors and the corporations. And if the corporation can be shown that it's not doing that, it can be sued. So the solution is to eliminate that problem so that engineers that have ethics are working in a fertile environment. And the way to do that is eliminate the requirement that the corporation produce max profit and max growth for the investors, which essentially, on a planetary basis, is a handful of people. And so you need to replace that with the quest for adequate profit, sustainable growth for the good of all. And that means if a corporation is acting ethically and breaking even to creating jobs, creating good products, that should be acceptable, but it isn't under the current system. And so the way to do that is to create a funding source that is based on adequate profit, sustainable growth, and the good of all. And that is exactly what I was talking about early on. You need to create a parallel economy, which is simple to do, that is based on that very principle. And those corporations that come into that economy or are created within that economy are going to be looking for ethical engineers and ethical engineers are going to be looking for companies like that, and those companies will outcompete corporations based on maximizing profit because those companies will be willing to break even and to maintain ethics, whereas traditional corporations won't be willing to break even. And that's, to me, the way to do it. Eliminate the pressure. Eliminate, because it's all based on only profit, regardless of the impact on the planet and the people.
Go ahead, Andrew. Go ahead.
A quick response. First of all, I agree with you on everything you just said, and I've thought about it for a long time. I don't know how to eliminate the pressure. And so my secondary strategy is to prepare engineers who will join those ethical companies where the few innovators are doing what they should be doing, and to align themselves with those companies to give them more power. That's all I can do at this point as an educator.
But very quickly, I won my arguments because I showed there was an economic risk if we didn't correct what I'd done in error. And
Yes.
also in the political situation in Canada during the Star Wars being, there was an extreme sense that there was a huge risk to Canadian security as a consequence of what was
Yeah,
happening.
I remember that. Yeah.
So there were two arguments which are based on risk.
Yeah.
Yep.
We're going to take these other two questions, but I could see a great panel discussion that we ought to formulate. But let's go on to Tom and then Avi.
Yes.
A quick preliminary question. When I studied as a philosophy major 60 years ago, one of my textbooks was written by Edgar Sheffield Brightman. Are you a descendant?
Thanks for asking. The answer is yes and no. I was adopted as a child into the Brightman family. I do know of Edgar Sheffield and have read some of his work. But I'm not biologically associated with him, but I feel philosophically I have some alignment.
Oh, that's wonderful. What a great.
Thank you, Tom.
I have,
I am from New England area. Yeah, I'm from New England area.
okay. My question is this, or observation is this. In the sciences and in engineering, everybody's looking outward, the outward factors. I wonder if ethical education needs also to include trying to educate people about themselves, about subjectivity, about the culture we are a part of. For example, somebody said the business of America is business. Well, that suggests we are a nation of entrepreneurs. But when I look at how our nation was assembled out of risk takers from every nation on earth, it seems we're pre-selected for risk taking and entrepreneurship. Having that as part of our awareness may help us be more ethical, but there's a whole world inside of us. Psychotherapy is an excellent educator. It gets us to face things that we don't want to face. Just lastly, I love the Roman Empire saying, wealth, the desire for wealth, is like drinking seawater. The more you drink of wealth, the more you want.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
Wonderful comment. Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. Avi, you have the last word, sir.
Awesome responsibility. Well, first, with regard to the overall presentation, excellent, great undertaking. It occurs to me that the foundation of this is the question of what are the ethical premises? When you talk about justice and what's right, the answer would be very different for a terrorist if you ask the Ayatollahs in Iran or somebody bent on terrorism because it's a holy mission to serve God. He's going to come up with very different answers. from somebody who has what I consider to be more rational, probably less emotional connection to some deity. So that's sort of at the bottom of all of that. Before you get to judgments, you have to evaluate the premises. The second is a response to Mark, the question. You've got 30 years, and I understand, look, like any other technology, it is a sword with two edges. Automobiles are wonderful, but they run over people. Medicine can produce drugs that cause dislocation as well as great benefit. So now, with a 30-year retrospective, Mark, on net, did your discovery and implementation produce more good than harm?
My own judgment, definitely more harm by orders of magnitude. It it
Interesting.
was the premise of, and as I said, it would have happened without me, but it was the premise of all the collection of refined data that turned people into inventory, whether that was Facebook, Netflix, the way in which people get assessed for loans, all of that comes out of the
What about
same
all the
model.
benefits that we got from it?
You asked me, I'm not denying there are. I'm saying that the
The
weighted
over,
balance here is indisputable to me.
I just think that Andrew, you've stimulated a tremendous amount of interest and conversation, and I really think we need to continue this somehow. And I'm really thinking that what we should have is a panel discussion instead of a presentation. We'll put together, as long as you guys are willing, we'll put together something in the fall that will be a panel discussion on engineering, educating engineer, teaching. What's your title? Can you teach engineers to be ethical? We'll talk about that as a panel, just conversation, because
Great.
I think there's so much more that we have to say about this, and I've run out of time, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to end it here. I want to thank you all for being really, really intensely involved and conversational. And Andrew, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Loud applause from the whole crew here.
My pleasure. My pleasure again. I would be happy to come back. I'd love to hear from more of you. Your examples are inspiring and insightful. So let's see if we
Do
can do
it.
it again.
We'll do it, guys. Thanks, everyone. See you again 2 weeks from today. Take care. Bye-bye.